In this tutorial, I'm going to explain the relationship between shutter speed, aperture, ISO, how they respond to light and their interrelationship. Adjusting any one of them can be compensated for by adjusting any others. For example, if you make the room brighter by raising the lights, you have to make your shutter speed faster to compensate for this. Now, I don't regard this as especially complex, but it's not easy to explain or understand from written media such as books. Therefore, we're going to undertake a series of tests with the DSLR camera and this tabletop setup. I suggest you watch this video from start to finish and then set up something similar yourself. All you really need is some way to control the room light, such as a dimmer switch. Once you get some practical experience, it'll all start to make more sense. The bottom line is that a lack of understanding of these principles will lead to problems with your photography. So let's get started. I'm going to start by taking our first picture on totally automatic mode. The active mode is called program mode. It's P on the dial on most cameras and essentially allows the camera to make all the decisions for you. If you're ever unsure about the settings, or you're giving the camera to somebody who isn't a competent photographer, set it on P mode and it'll take care of everything for you. However, for those of us who master shutter speed, aperture, ISO and light, this is a mode that you really won't ever want to use. And this is because you'll want to be able to take control of those conditions yourself. So what I'm going to do now is cut the lights in the room by about half, and then I'll take another picture. The camera recording this video is set to auto exposure, so the light should dim before returning to something close to where we were before. As you can see, the exposure on the shot didn't really change between these two pictures. The brightness of the picture is pretty much the same. This is because the camera auto exposed it. The camera looked at the light in the room and it adjusted the ISO, the aperture and the shutter speed in order to get a well exposed picture. However, there was a side effect. By comparing the two images, you'll notice that the fan is a little bit more blurred in the second image than it was in the first. This is because the camera lengthened the shutter speed to expose the picture properly with less light. This is one of the reasons you need to understand the exposure triangle, because you might or might not want that extra blur in your shot. You should have also noticed that the brightness didn't change. A lot of people think that they can change any one of these settings and it'll adjust the brightness of the picture in automatic mode. However, this isn't quite correct. You can adjust the ISO, the shutter speed, the aperture, or the light in the environment room, and the camera is always going to adapt to it, so changing any one of these won't change your brightness. If you want to change your brightness, use exposure compensation. On most cameras this is controlled with a dial on the back, although sometimes you may need to press an extra button or even go into the menu system. Just as an example, I'm going to add a stop of exposure compensation so that we can see the difference. As you can see, the picture did get brighter. It actually got one stop brighter, to be precise, because I adjusted the exposure compensation by one stop. A stop in photography is doubling or halving the light. So if you double the amount of light in a room, then you've added one stop of light. If you cut the shutter speed conversely in half, say you go from 1 to 250th a second to 1/500th of a second, you increase the shutter stop by one stop. I'm now going to move the camera into manual mode. So in the auto mode, the ISO, the aperture, the shutter speed are all unlocked, so that the camera can adjust any one of them. However, in manual mode, we can lock down everything and prevent the camera from making any automatic decisions, and it's this that gives us complete control. So I'm going to set it to manual mode, and then I'm going to configure it so that it'll expose the picture properly. I'll then take a test shot. So what I did there was to set the camera to manual mode, give it a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. Aperture was set to f2.8 and the ISO to 6400. Those settings together allow the camera to expose the picture decently. You can also see that the blade on the fan is just about frozen, because 1/1000th is a pretty fast shutter speed. You can also see that the objects in the background, the figure, the pool balls, the book, etc., are all quite blurred. Now as we make some adjustments later, these will come more into focus. Next we'll experiment by changing the ISO. By the way, ISO isn't an acronym, it's actually a term referring to the sensitivity of the camera's sensor. If you increase the ISO from say 100 to 200, you're effectively increasing the ISO sensitivity by one stop, so doubling the sensitivity of the sensor. The typical usage range goes from about 100 to 6400. This was set at 6400, which is a very high sensitivity, so the image is pretty bright. And I did this to compensate for the room being quite dark. I'll now reduce this to 3200 and we'll see the effects. As you can see, the picture got darker. As the ISO gets lower, the camera gets less sensitive to light. And if you don't adjust the other elements, such as aperture or shutter speed automatically, then the picture is going to get darker. So let's move the ISO up 2 more stops to H1, or that's 12,800, and we'll see what the effect is. As you might have guessed, the picture got considerably brighter, and this is because we increased the sensitivity of the camera without changing any of the other settings. And because we're in manual mode, all the settings except the one we were controlling are locked. Now I'm going to switch back to program mode, which will make everything except ISO automatic. And I'll then take a couple of shots at different ISOs so you can see the effects. You can see here that the camera exposed the picture at 1/350 of a second shutter speed, an exposure of f5.6, and you can see the shots well exposed. Now I'm going to drop the ISO by 2 stops down to 3200, and this effectively means that the camera will need 4 times as much light to get the same exposure. As you can see, the picture's still well exposed, but the camera had to change the settings to compensate for this. You can see that the shutter was reduced to 1/180 and the aperture was reduced down to f4, thereby increasing the light. As you can see, the result of the longer shutter speed has caused the blades to become more blurred. I'm now going to drop the ISO all the way down to 100. And because the camera's in automatic mode, I can change the ISO to anything and the picture will still expose properly. But let's take a look at the pictures and we should see some really important differences. As we get really close into this picture, we can see that the pictures at high ISO are really noisy. This is the digital equivalent of film grain, and it's unpleasant and it's actually really destructive for potential visual effects work. High noise is therefore always something to be avoided. Now if we look at that ISO 100 picture, you can see that it's nice and clean, it's noise free. ISO 100 is almost always better than a higher ISO. But one of the challenges of photography is that when we choose a low ISO, then we're going to have to change some of the other settings, such as the shutter speed and or the aperture as well. So now let's take a look at the shutter speed. You can control the shutter speed by putting your camera into shutter priority mode. On almost all cameras this is marked with an S, but on Canon cameras this is marked by TV. By putting the camera into shutter priority mode, it gives you control over the shutter so you can specify how slow or how fast you want it. The camera will change the other settings for you, most noticeably the aperture and perhaps the ISO as well, to allow the picture to be exposed properly. So you use shutter speed priority mode when the speed of the picture is important to you. So if there's a moving subject in your picture, then you want to switch to shutter priority. So examples of that might be action sports, maybe a dog or a cat running, a bird flying, etc. These are all times when you might want the shutter to be in shutter priority mode so that you reduce the amount of motion blur. And for visual effects shots, this is typically how we reduce and eliminate motion blur from the shot. So I'm now going to take a picture with the default settings but in shutter priority mode. At a shutter speed of 1/250 of a second, the fan's pretty well blurred. Now let's imagine that we want to slow these blades down almost as if the fan was turned off. So I'm therefore going to increase the shutter speed to 1/1000 of a second. And you can see that now they look nice and sharp. But what if this isn't the effect you want? What if you actually want to maximize motion blur? This is really common if you're shooting things like moving cars where you want to see some dynamic motion, for example in the wheels. If the shutter's too fast, then you can freeze too much of this motion. And intentionally removing or increasing motion blur is one of the tricks, and it's one of the benefits of using shutter speed. Let's drop the shutter speed down to 1/60th of a second and have a look at the effect. So with this there's that nice motion blur that I was looking for. At that speed the fan blades are a complete blur. So shutter priority gives you control over how much motion you want your pictures to show. Bear in mind that there's also motion in your hands. So if you're hand holding a picture and it's turning out blurry, this is known as camera shake. You can control that by using shutter priority and specifying a shutter speed that's fast enough for you to hold. Now we're going to have a look at what happens when we change the lights. Shutter speed gives you control over the shutter, and the camera won't change that. The camera will change the aperture, and if you've also chosen auto ISO, it'll change that as well. But it'll never ever change the shutter. You've got complete control over that. So I'm now going to drop the lights to about half, and we'll see what the camera does differently. As you can see, when I lowered the lights in the room, the camera compensated for that, not by changing the shutter, but by lowering the f-stop number, or the exposure. Choosing a lower f-stop number opens up the aperture, or the iris of the camera, letting more light in. So it had to do that in order to get the picture to be properly exposed. But instead of priority, you control the shutter and the camera controls the aperture. So on that note, let's take a deeper look at aperture. I'll switch the camera into aperture priority mode and I'll take my first picture. I took that first picture at an f-stop of 8, which is a pretty moderate f-stop number. One of the things that aperture controls, besides the amount of light that gets in through the iris, is the depth of field. There are other factors that influence depth of field as well, but for the sake of this, we're only controlling the aperture. So at f8, I got the objects in the background broadly in focus. But let's say we want them to be really nice and sharp. To achieve this, I'll choose an higher f-stop. So let's crank the f-stop up and increase the background sharpness as well. At f32, I've got enough depth of field that you can read the title of the book in the background. So I'm controlling the aperture in aperture priority mode rather than in the camera. So let's imagine that we don't want to see the background in focus. Let's imagine that we want a nicely blurred background. This is really popular in portraits, where having a nice blurred background helps eliminate any disturbances or distractions. To achieve this, I'll use a low f-stop number, which will reduce background sharpness. I'll crank it down to f2.8 and take another picture. At f2.8 the book is completely blurred, and even the figure in the centre of the table is pretty blurry as well. You can also see that the fan blades are a little bit more distinct. This is because the camera chose a faster shutter speed, because I was using a larger iris, or a larger aperture, which will let in more light. There's one final thing to cover, which is how a flash can control the amount of light in the room totally automatically. So I'll attach a flash to this camera and then take a picture. As you can see, the flash had an interesting effect on the fan blades. It's effectively froze the motion altogether, although you still can see some motion blur. When the flash actually fired, the imprint of the blades at that current position were burned onto the sensor. However, because they were moving for the rest of the time the shutter was open, you see this kind of interesting effect where they're kind of blurred and frozen at the same time, almost like a ghost moving into position. And this is one of the cool tricks that you can do with a flash. Now, why might you want to use a flash and add light? Firstly, you might want front lighting. Say for example your subject is backlit, and a front light might fill in some of the shadows. You might also want to add a flash because you're not happy with the compromise that's been given to you of the shutter speed, the ISO and the aperture, given the amount of light in the shot. If you're forced to use an ISO 6400, but you just can't accept the amount of noise in the picture, you can always put a flash on and add a little light to the room, and this will allow you to shoot with a lower ISO. Okay, so that's it. I hope you found the tutorial and the demonstration useful. So I hope that you're going to get on and set up a test rig and practice using these camera controls. So good luck.